Now, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, whose voice helped end apartheid in South Africa, has died at the age of 90. His denunciation from the pulpit of white supremacist South Africa helped tear down the government's racist policies and usher in democracy and black majority rule. He was a staunch advocate of non-violence, a stand that led to a Nobel Peace Prize in 1984. The head of the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, spoke for many when he said the world is different because of this man. We'll devote the next 45 minutes to Archbishop Desmond Tutu's legacy and discuss his influence in South Africa, both during and after apartheid.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu was one of our nation's finest patriots. He was a man of unwavering courage, of principled conviction, and whose life was spent in the service of others. He in many ways embodied the essence of our humanity. Knowing he had been ill for some time now does very little to lessen the blow that has been dealt to South Africa this very sad day.
Cyril Ramaphosa. Well, for more on the life and legacy of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, I crossed to the port city of Cape Town to speak to Mmusi Maimane, former leader of South Africa's main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance. Loss for the people of South Africa. Condolences have been pouring in as well as messages of tribute. How do you remember Desmond Tutu?
Desmond Tutu is an incredible South African, obviously as a Nobel laureate, as a reconciler, as a man of peace, as a spiritual leader, is a huge loss to South Africa. I think that my interactions with Archbishop Desmond Tutu were one where I found him to be one that was witty, always had an incredible sense of humor, but one of a justice fighter. You know, we had many interactions around the subject of reconciliation between black and white South Africans, and he was forthright in fighting for justice, regardless of what the government of the day was. So to me, it feels indeed like a light has been, a leading light has been taken out in South Africa. And I think we don't only mourn because we have huge gratitude for who Archbishop Desmond Tutu was, but we mourn because I think we live in a global society today where when you reflect on the state of the world, where polarization is well on its table, truth has long been forgotten, and we live in a world of disinformation, where so many have still been marginalized, you become anxious that as a generation of those who stood for truth and justice are dying, their legacy is following them. And I think for us as the people of South Africa, this is a very reflective moment and one that we need to find our reckoning to prepare ourselves for a tomorrow that's coming.
And talking about his legacy, how important do you think his role was in ending apartheid in South Africa?
Well, he was one of those who you could define as a midwife to our democracy. So as a young activist, certainly in the time of the early 90s, South Africa went through one of its bloodiest periods between 1990 and 1994. Ethnic violence was part of the norm. And I can remember even some of the political parties not wanting to participate in a democratic election. It was Archbishop Tutu, along with people like Desmond Tutu and other members of the clergy, such as Ray McCauley, who got together and said, it cannot end a bloodbath. We must choose the path of peace. When others were calling for revenge, Archbishop Tutu said, no, a peaceful transition is the route to that. Subsequent to that, obviously the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is unique, certainly in the African continent, where such matters in many people were calling for bloodshed and a settling of scores and revenge, he said, let's give people an opportunity to come and speak the truth and reconcile. I think in part, he allowed us the transition. I think he was failed in some ways by other aspects of the state that should have fought harder for the issues of justice, where we should have been more forthright and say, how can we bring on board the consequences for those who did such atrocities? And I think, to me, when I look at Archbishop Tutu, I would not be able to stand up today as a South African, being willing to say, let us build one South Africa, a South Africa that works for all, black and white, had it not been for the incredible work that people like Archbishop Tutu did, along with others such as Nelson Mandela, in whom I would put Archbishop Tutu in a similar class of citizen.
So, I mean, just picking up from what you said now, which, by the way, sounded brilliant, was his message perhaps greater after the end of apartheid because of that message of reconciliation rather than retribution?
I certainly believe so, because given the context of what South Africa was going through, when you look at the SADC region, or the Southern African region, other parts, other countries alongside us were undergoing moments of instability. And Archbishop Tutu became very conscious about the fact that if we're going to see a transition, it ought to be peaceful. And his words, even to the apartheid government, were one coming from a moral authority, one that spoke as though as he welcomed the Dalai Lama to South Africa, even in a very controversial time, Archbishop Tutu was willing to stand up for that. But the power of Archbishop Tutu was that he was one who was able to free not only the prisoner, but also the jailer in that sense, in that he saw humanity even in some of the most difficult circumstances where black people and white people were certainly enemies of each other. Archbishop Tutu was able to see the divine in every human being, that principle of Ubuntu, that he was able to invite even the most difficult people to the negotiating table to find a way forward. So I certainly think, to me, given the context of where South Africa was at, you could not have done it without Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he certainly did not even shy away from speaking truth to a democratically elected government, proving the same principle that said Archbishop understood that justice transcends race and that he's willing to fight for justice regardless of whoever is committing the injustice.
And he did become subsequently very disappointed with various political figures in South Africa. Was he much more hopeful towards the end, or was he still very concerned about the direction of the country, particularly after Jacob Zuma and that period?
I think, the last interaction I had with Archbishop Tutu, I sat in his lounge and we were discussing the future of South Africa. And I think there's a famous of his words when he stands up, he says, we're heading toward the time where we will pray for the destruction of the ANC. And I think those words still ring true today. I think they ring true in the sense that he's become all too aware of the fact that the conditions that so many people were left out are still continuing in South Africa. So many people still linger in poverty. So many people are still not full participants of freedom in this country, even though they have a right to vote and their constitutional rights are protected. But their economic rights are not protected. Their right to education, their right to that freedoms that we take for granted are still far from gone. And there is no material evidence that demonstrates the fact that this government is fighting hard to almost correct that injustice. And I think Archbishop Tutu would have been one who felt deeply betrayed in the struggle when you realize that those who are now in charge of liberation have simply resorted to looting and corruption. And South Africa and Africa needs to say to itself, if it is going to honor the life of Archbishop Tutu, who's not only a South African icon, a global icon, we need to pull up our socks. We need to say to ourselves, Haluta continua, let the struggle continue. We need to fight more for his values. And certainly for me, as a personal reflection, it says to me that if you were silent before, now is the time to speak up. If you were one who was maybe apathetic of taking action against those who are perpetrating injustice, you need to stand up. And it's not only a question of South Africa, but it's a question of what happens in the region, in Zimbabwe, when I think about what happens in Uganda, when I think about what happens globally in terms of exclusion and racial polarization. We need to find our voice and continue the legacy of Archbishop Desmond Tutu if we are going to take on the baton for future generations to sit under the freedoms that we take for granted today.
Mmusi Maimane, former leader of South Africa's main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, talking to me earlier from Cape Town.